Well, the election is over. The actual numbers and seat counts didn't change much, but our guests today are concerned that our political system may lack a little bit of credibility in the eyes of many, many Canadians. Robert Asselin, former budget and policy advisor to Prime Ministers Paul Martin and Justin Trudeau, is now a senior VP of policy at the Business Council of Canada. And he wrote recently that, in fact, party platforms are now just collections of focus group-driven policies rather than actual blueprints for governing. Our next guest, Sean Speer, the former senior economic advisor to Prime Minister Harper, now with the Munk School, and he's also the Public Policy Forum Fellow for Strategic Competitiveness, fears this issue too, that federal government has essentially become just a revenue collection agency that exists to transfer dollars to individuals and lower levels of government. Welcome to you both. Great to see you, and thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
That's great. Let me start out. Just a sec. Are we losing you there, Sean? No, you're back. Okay.
No, I just said my baby is crying. I'm just going to close the door. Okay.
Okay. Is there somebody with the baby, Sean? Or
yes.
Good enough. Otherwise, you could bring the baby in, and that would work. Okay. Let me start here. That we spent $600 million on an election. The Liberals have 32% of the popular vote. The Conservatives have 34% of the popular vote, meaning how people in Canada actually view this. But we have a left-leaning majority government if you look at the coalition with the NDP. So, Robert, how do we actually get there when the Canadians have a very different view of what politics should look like?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question, Senator. When you look at the last two elections, there's kind of lines of fracture that we see, both rural, urban, regional fractures. I'm seeing one in this election with Francophone Quebec and the rest of Quebec on this issue that was raised in the debate. I think overall there's a consensus that no one felt very inspired by this election. It's not really original for me to add on this, but I'll say that it speaks to the lack of long-term vision, I think, for a lot of political parties and leaders. And I think it's a structural issue we have in our politics that it's tough for people to see where they see the country going forward. And I think this mitigated response we just got from the electorate is kind of a immediate response to this, that, you know, we basically give you a marching order 2 years ago. You're asking us again, basically on the same kind of things. And we're telling you again what we told you 2 years ago. And so this is how overall I'm kind of reading the results. I'm not seeing that much of the left and right divide, but more of these kind of fractures that I just spoke about that are, I think, beginning to show that Canada has a bit of a unity problem right now.
For sure. Sean?
Well, let me just say two things, Senator Wallin. First of all, it's striking, isn't it, that the first past the post system is supposed to produce majority governments, and yet in this century we've had more minorities than we've had majorities, and I think that reflects the fracturing and the splintering that Robert talked about. We now have multiple parties, you know, with north of 5% of the vote, and that's producing these minority parliaments over and over again. The second thing I'll say, Senator Wallin, is that Robert talked about a lack of inspiration. I can't help but think that our political class has come to underestimate Canadians, that there's a tendency for the different parties to kind of think of voters as purely financially self-interested. And so you then have the different parties kind of competing with financial offerings to different slices of the population. If you're a senior, you get $500. If you're a teacher, you get $150. If you're a parent, you get $1,000. And I actually think Canadians would be responsive to something beyond this kind of auctioneering form of politics, that they would be responsive to a leader or a party that articulated a concrete vision for the future and a plan to get there. What's striking to me, Senator Wallin, is a poll that we published at the hub.ca, a media organization that I'm part of, that showed that 47% of Canadians don't know what the future holds when asked about the state of the pandemic. I mean, what does that say about our country, that most people feel like they've lost agency, like they've lost control over their lives? And I think they were yearning for a vision of the future and that would inspire them, as Robert says. And instead, they really got this kind of transactional form of politics. And I think in the end, what they said is, essentially a pox on all your houses.
I want to quote Robert back to himself and to you. In the era of permanent campaigns, which is to your point, we keep doing this and asking for mandates for no reason. It's increasingly difficult to distinguish election campaigns from governing mandates. We used to have campaigns to guide governing mandates, to Sean's point, that the vision question. And now we just see, governing mandates only serving up to kind of set the stage for the next campaign. There is no vision. There is just, as to Sean's use his word, auctioneering, buy us with our own cash.
I think it's true substantively, and it's also true in the form of the politics we practice. And I was struck in this pandemic election to see leaders going cross country, doing tours around the countries and planes, and like these fake images with like that they're meeting people when we know it was almost impossible given the provincial rules or health rules, and just this disconnect between how politics is practiced and the way politicians speak with these coded focus group lines. And I personally think that Canadians are not responding well to that. And I think there's a huge appetite for people who talk normally. And I think one politician that is interesting in that regard is Premier Legault. You will actually never see him read script. He speaks very bluntly about how he thinks. Sometimes he makes mistakes, and sometimes he's
telling people to vote for the Conservatives. Yeah.
And sometimes his opinions are controversial. But I think Quebecers are responding very favorably to this kind of authenticity, where he just basically calls it as he sees it. And I'm not seeing that at the federal level. I see a lot of politicians speaking in codes, and a lot of people just not being interested to listen to basically recorded tapes,
Yeah.
Senator Wallin,
go
ahead.
The
American scholar Yuval Levin talks about how politics used to be a place where you did things. Now it's a stage for performance. In effect, we have a kind of performative politics, and that's been a problem in the United States for some time. But it's starting to be imported in Canada as well. I mean, just think about it, Senator Wallin. Over the course of this campaign, there were major developments. Afghanistan collapsed into chaos.
On the day he called the election.
In the second quarter, we had an economic contraction. About a week ago, we saw the largest spike in inflation in more than a decade. So there was plenty of big, meaty issues for the different parties to address and to communicate to Canadians in the authentic way that Robert is describing what they would do about these issues, how they thought about them. And instead, there was essentially none of that. In fact, the Conservative Party's message down the stretch was how much the bloody election cost, as if somehow that was supposed to inspire Canadians to go out and vote for them in the context of a pandemic. And so
I've got go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that the issue, the problem here wasn't that there weren't a lot of issues on offer. It's that our political class seemed immune to addressing them.
And the media class. I'm sorry, when you have numbers like, the inflation rate has doubled essentially to twice what the Bank of Canada said is even acceptable, and nobody really even asks a question about it. And that's stunning to me, Robert.
Yeah, I've long believed that our campaigns have become this horse race competition where polls basically frame the coverage, the media coverage, and who's ahead, who's behind, who's trailing, who's performing is basically shaping all the media coverage. And I guess, to be fair, a part of it, I guess, is of some interest to the electorate to see, who's doing well. But I think to your point, if all the coverage reflects only this horse race syndrome, then people are not finding any answers to the questions they have about real problems. And it just bugs me that on problems that are complex, such as inflation,
Mhm.
on both sides, we only hear things that would play in the margins and at best that are misrepresentative of the truth, which is it's not just a product of government spending. There are supply issues, there are global issues, there is monetary policy consideration. And again, it speaks to Sean's basically point about telling Canadians how they think about these things. And I think that there's also a space in politics to say, look, this is not black and white, this is complicated. I agree that affordability is an issue, but here's what I can do on the fiscal policy side, and where's the Bank of Canada can do independently. But these discussions don't occur, and so it's almost like a dumbing down on of issues. And then I think for the electorate, it's really hard to really compare. And I don't want to be all negative. I think there were fundamental differences between parties. And I agree that on some things there were clear differentiations. I just think that solutions, the way they are communicated, only play in the margins of these problems. They're not really addressing the core issues, I think.
I want to come back to that issue and run with it, but honestly, I get so frustrated with this horse race thing that they're
Yes.
neck and neck. We know why the media organizations do it. It's so people will tune in on election night and watch their endless coverage, and it will give their folks prime real estate to present themselves, more of that platform presentation politics you talk about. We know in this country that that horse race doesn't matter because of the very issue we talked about. You've got 32%, 34%, and the numbers go one way and not the other. So, I mean, we at a certain point just have to say, who cares about the polls calling it a horse race? Sean, good luck with responding.
Well, let me run with those observations this way, Senator Wallin. I think one of the things that Mr. O'Toole sought to do in this campaign is address a kind of fundamental issue with the Conservative Party, which is the Conservative Party of Canada. Listeners may be surprised to hear has the highest floor of support of any of the major parties. It's something like 26, 27%. That's pretty rock solid. And we know, in fact, that the other parties have at different times over the past decade or so fallen below that threshold. But the Conservatives have the corresponding problem, which is that they have a relatively low ceiling. Over the past couple of years, maybe even longer, we've rarely seen the party get up over, say, 35, 36%. And so I think what Mr. O'Toole sought to do in this campaign was essentially raise the ceiling of the party support with trying to minimize the erosion of the floor. And I think, that was the right strategy. But what we saw in a number of ridings across the country, that those efforts to raise the ceiling resulted in the floor falling out in some places. And that manifested itself, of course, in national support of the People's Party of 5%. But in some ridings, the People's Party had double-digit support, and in fact, flipped some ridings to the Liberals or the New Democrats because of the very vote splits that the Conservative Party of Canada was created to address. So I think the Conservative Party has some big questions coming out of this campaign,
Right.
about how can it expand its level of support, particularly parts of central Canada, while at the same time not exposing itself on its right flank, because the only way the Conservatives are going to compete and win elections, Senator Wallin, is through addition, not subtraction. And I think that's
Exactly.
one of the major takeaways for me out of last night's results.
But it's not clear, and I'm just going to stay with you for a moment, Sean. Okay, we saw Prime Minister Harper win with, a majority government, so it can be done. Then what we saw happen is when you embrace the right, it doesn't work. And when you reject the right, which Mr. O'Toole tried to do, leave that to Max Bernier and just say, I'm going to be more centrist here, and I'm going to bring Brian Mulroney out. And in fact, even my policy on carbon tax is going to sound like a liberal policy. Then you can't win with that point of view either. So it leads you to the conclusion that Conservatives actually can't win if they have the coalition together or if they don't.
I think that's an open question, Senator Wallin. If there is a kind of, in the Conservative Party's DNA, this kind of one-for-one trade-off that may preclude it from growing its base of support without losing voters. I think that's an open question. And one of the factors that has contributed to this conundrum is the genius advice of my friend Robert Asselin. Because one of the things that the Liberal Party has done since Mr. Trudeau became the leader, I guess back in 2013, is it has consistently cannibalized the support of the New Democrats by moving to the left, which is creating in a lot of places essentially two-party races. And Conservatives aren't going to be able to compete against in a two-party system at its current level of support. So I think these are kind of big questions facing the Conservatives. I'll just say this in wrapping up, though, on this point, Senator Wallin, is I think it would be a mistake to kind of ratchet back and forth from the way that you described. So this was a reaction to 2019. I think it would be a mistake to overcorrect next time around. There has to be a balance here that, on one hand, speaks to and motivates core Conservative voters, and at the same time reaches out to swing accessible voters that the party's going to need if it's going to be able to compete and win in subsequent elections.
So, Robert, I want to hear you on the conundrum for the Conservative Party, but also for the Liberal Party, because without the NDP, or with the NDP, they get to be a majority government, and without it, it's a problem.
Yes. So I don't want to go too much into partisan politics for obvious reasons, but I've long believed that elections in Canada are won with the reasonable center, and that if you go too much on the left or too much on the right, I think you'll be penalized. I actually think Mr. O'Toole's strategy was sound in this election, and I don't think it's clear to me that because you take more votes in the center, that you will necessarily at the end overall be less well positioned to win an election by leaving the more right wing of the party. I think if you look at the Mulroney coalition, if you look at most provincial governments, I think that's also the case. Canadians are reasonable centrist people, I think. And I think the center of gravity in Canadian politics is still the center, the pragmatic center, I would say. But I agree on the Liberal side that there is a calculation that you need to be to appeal to progressive. It's not clear to me that going too much on the left, though, will win you governments, in this case, majority governments, as we just seen, because you expose yourself too much on leaving the center, the reasonable center. So I think it's a delicate balance, but I think overall Canadians tend to agree with more pragmatic centrist parties than people who become too ideological either on the left or right.
But the coalition with the NDP, I mean, using that word loosely, but obviously they're there to support them. I mean, that really does help the Liberals, because if they want to spend, they've got backup to do it. The NDP will support them. And if they don't want to spend, they can say, we're trying to be more fiscally responsible than those guys over on the far left. So it really positions them well.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I would just caution people that I think that the pandemic is not a great example in a sense that on the spending side, I think this clear left turn, and some of it was warranted given the crisis, but it's not sustainable over a medium long term horizon. In other words, if we were to continue to just say budget after budget, we'll spend tens of
Yeah.
billions of dollars in new social programs without creating the wealth that would
Yeah.
allow for it, I think Canadians would have a pretty strong reaction, and eventually the government would be voted out of office. So I don't think this is a permanent thing, and I think the Liberal Party, in my view, needs to be very careful about this.
Sean, I mean, the flip side is then true in terms of that coalition that Brian Mulroney pulled together, but that was in the pre-Trump era. Now you've got the Max Bernier phenomenon because it's unleashed in our political culture now. So it's hard to see where we're trying to bring them into the tent gives the Conservatives any strength or ability to keep that centrist role, because they're the ones that will already try and restrain spending.
I think that's right, Senator Wallin. And as Robert says, I think one needs to look at last night's results through the lens of the pandemic. I think that in hindsight, the political class and the rest of us who've actually done pretty well over the course of this pandemic underestimated the kind of practical and psychological effects on people. Senator Wallin, the kind of social costs of speaking out against the kind of conventional wisdom on lockdowns and all of these other issues. And what Maxime Bernier did was he gave people affirmation or validation to express themselves on these issues in a way that the media and politicians and physicians and other members of the kind of elite opinion had really suppressed, I think, over the past 20 months. I'm not in any way defending or justifying the People's Party.
No,
I'm just saying I really do think that, for me, I was surprised, I admit, that there was this level of anger and frustration within the Canadian population. And I think Maxime Bernier was sophisticated enough to basically run with it. And I think the open question for me is whether the People's Party support in this election has durability, or if it really is a kind of reflection of this extraordinary set of circumstances in which we find ourselves.
And letting off steam.
Exactly.
Okay, so I watched the election with a group of people here in Saskatchewan, which some of the analysts are saying has now become the hub of the Conservative Party because it was 14 out of 14. The Alberta, we saw New Democrats and Liberals elected, although I think some of the numbers are still out there. But there was an undercurrent, regardless of people who came to this group, and there were Liberals and there were people who were sympathetic to the New Democrats, but their view was this doesn't reflect what's going on in our part of the country. People talking about Western separation in a way that we just can't ever get a look in from this point of view. You talked about this at the beginning, Robert, the fractures that are there that are, we've seen in Quebec, but boy, are they here and are they real?
Yeah, no, I see that. And I think part of it is structural to Canada, to be honest. They've been there for a long time. Justin Trudeau's father experienced it very vividly. When he did
exacerbated it.
Yes, you could argue. And then I think, this whole reform Bloc Québécois period was also a manifestation of the fracture that I think is still with us today. It's kind of amazing to me. I'll speak more as a Quebecer, but that the Bloc Québécois, after all these years, is still able to gather the support. A sovereignist party at the federal level is still able to gather support of Francophone Quebecers in a majority. I mean, they won the Francophone vote by about 10% yesterday, which to me is quite telling. And I can totally see what you're describing happening in the West, the sense of lack of empowerment vis-a-vis the federal government, and this lack of misunderstanding of their issues. And And so it's on the prime minister, frankly, and on any prime minister to make national unity a daily priority, and not just with words, but with actions. And I think there's no greater responsibility because our country is not designed to be easy. It's designed to be difficult. And at best, things are okay on the national unity front, but at worst, they can be really bumpy. So I think you need good representation, and you need to make sure that there's a genuine sense that you don't dismiss any region, you know.
Well, that's the problem. I mean, Sean, and I'm going to put this kind of crudely, but I think what Westerners have seen is that blackmail through the whole the role of the bloc has worked in Quebec. They have no illusion that it's going to work here.
Yeah, I think it's been kind of compounding problems in Western Canada in recent years. Not only has there been economic challenges, of course, but then there's been perceptions that the federal government is less responsive to their needs, and even the kind of polarization happening in Alberta itself is really striking to me. I haven't been in Alberta for some time because of the pandemic, of course, but just from the outside looking in, it seems like the politics there are just hotter than anywhere else in the country. And so I think all of those factors are contributing to this sense of anger and frustration that you referred to. The only thing I would say, in addition to what Robert said, Senator Wallin, is I think part of it reflects the kind of lack of agenda or vision at the national level. In the absence of a kind of common vision for the country, things devolve into zero-sum competition. And so, I think when the country is at its best, it's when we have something that we're oriented towards that everybody can see themselves in. Whether that's the Olympics, or whether that's hockey, or whether that's the Afghanistan mission in the early days after 9/11, or any number of issues. I think, a big national vision isn't going to solve the structural problems that Robert described, but it is a means by which people can kind of come together and see themselves as part of something bigger than their region or their sector or their occupation or whatever. And I think that's that big vision has been lacking from Canadian politics for some time.
But there isn't, I mean, you talk about the obvious things that used to work, what this Olympics. If you say we're going to the Olympics, it provokes a debate about our foreign policy vis-a-vis China, whether we didn't shut down the borders, whether we wasted a bunch of time trying to buy vaccines from them, whether or not they're horrible, on their human rights record is horrible. There doesn't seem to be an issue which just is that simple thing. Let's win the ball game and I'll be happy. I mean, we seem to be past those days. Sean, take a stab at that.
Well, there's something to that. But Robert and I, and some of the work we've been doing, Senator Wallin, we've gone back and we've listened to John Kennedy's speech where he articulated this national goal of getting to the moon in the decade of the 1960s. This new frontier that crossed sectors, crossed parts of the country, created this economic value, and gave something for people to kind of aspire to. And I think, we need our modern day moonshot, whatever that is, as a kind of
what could it
project.
be like? That's what I'm saying. The obvious moonshots don't exist because they've all been tainted with politics, both domestic or foreign.
Well, that may be true, but I think there are I think there are some things that people ought to be able to see themselves in. We've talked about progress on being an energy superpower or oceanic discovery. We're the only country in the world surrounded by 3 oceans. We have the largest coastline by a magnitude. So I think there are, it seems to me, different ways in which we can try to build a kind of national project. But I agree, in the absence of that, there's a real risk that we devolve into these regional and other identities that Robert talked about off the top.
May I just add something on
Yeah.
that? I think we have also to accept we live in a federation, and that means that people who put their name on a ballot to go at the federal level must speak about the idea of Canada. And that really bugs me when I see, for example, my fellow Quebecers MPs from all stripes going to Ottawa arguing that Quebec should have more power. Well, why are they not running in Quebec at the National Assembly if that's their goal? At one point, there needs to be a desire to be more than a collection of provinces, and we need to speak to a country. And of course, we're so diverse and so big in terms of our geography that I realize it's a tough balance. Like we need to respect provincial jurisdiction and all that stuff. But it struck me that this election, we spent a lot of time talking about things that provincial governments do, including healthcare, and not much about what a national government should be doing, which is, do we have a science agenda? Do we have an economic agenda? Do we have a vision for the future on foreign policy and our place in the world? What's our position vis-a-vis China? Yes, it's complicated. Yes, it's not black and white. But let's have a discussion as opposed to just saying China is bad and we're just going to close our borders. You know, this makes little sense to me. So I just think federal politicians need to be more ambitious about federal powers and what we ought to do as a country, you know.
Well, that's what Sean, what you were writing, that, you know, that Ottawa's become, the federal government's become this revenue collection agency, and then they decide on what day they'll give it to such and such a citizen, on what day they'll give it to such and such a province, depending on whether it's politically advantageous.
That's exactly right, Senator Wallin. You know, when at Confederation, you know, the fathers of Confederation were, you know, guarded national power so strongly because they had this vision for the country. And what's striking to me, as Robert says, we spent a campaign fighting about provincial health care, local housing decisions, provincial childcare, provincial long-term care, all at the same time, Senator Wallin. The United States, the UK, and Australia were signing a trilateral security agreement.
And we weren't at the table.
Exactly. As I wrote in the National Post early in the campaign, we were having a Section 92 campaign and a Section 91 moment.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what I think when I think back on elections I've covered and all of those things, that we fought passionately for years over the Constitution and whose powers mattered, and we got into a very granular discussion about that in this country, with well-informed premiers at a table challenging a well-informed prime minister. We had energy policy debates over the national energy policy put forward by Mr. Lalonde and Mr. Trudeau. We had an election, two of them on free trade, but certainly one that was, these are big issues that matter to everybody, regardless of your political stripe.
Yeah, I agree. And I think right now, I don't disagree childcare is an important issue. I don't see it as something the federal government must deliver on, in the sense that it must cooperate to make it happen with provincial governments. But let's be honest, essentially we'll just transfer money to provinces to do something. And so this idea that you'll have bureaucrats in Ottawa deciding how we do childcare, to me, is a bit absurd, you know. And, you know, there's a reasonable debate on childcare, whether you need more choices and what's the role of the private sector. I just don't feel that as a national government, it must be the sole focus of a campaign on big policy. And I felt that was the case. So I agree that childcare is increasingly economic policy because it speaks to labor participation and in the workforce. But it seems to me we're spending a lot of time not discussing really important things that national government can do, including a strategy to grow the economy, you know.
Right. That simple thing that we just decided not to talk about during the campaign for some reason. No, but
Right.
even childcare, like that kind of an issue. I mean, when you live in rural parts of this country, you're not talking about whether you're having $10 a day daycare. There are no daycares. You take your children to the neighbor lady. That's how it works, right? That's who's there. So again, it was just not resonating with some people. So Sean, just take a shot at that.
Well, let me just say this, Senator. I don't want to make it sound like we're all negative or that we're wallowing or something. Let me just say this. I think one positive development in our politics that has gone underreported is the generational kind of transformation of Parliament. It's really striking. It's I know the Conservative Party best. Listeners won't be surprised to hear that. But from 2015 to now 2021, the caucus has really fundamentally transformed. We have caucus members born, a number of caucus members who are millennials. We have caucus members born in the 1990s sitting in the Conservative caucus. And so I think that should bring a kind of new energy, a new set of priorities. I mean, these are people who weren't part of the Cold War fights and the set of issues that really animated conservatism coming out of the Reagan era and so on. So I think that's a positive development that hopefully will bring kind of new perspectives, new issues, new arguments. I think that's one of the healthy developments, not just of last night's campaign, but really the last few cycles.
Well, as somebody I know really well was just telling me this morning, because he was working at a polling station, that when Jean Chrétien came in to vote, the young person sitting beside him asked for a second piece of ID because they had no idea who he was.
That's so interesting. That's so interesting. We kind of forget that, but I think for millennials, for example, there are a lot of references that the three of us have about what happened in the past that they wouldn't even think about. So I think to Sean's point, every generation kind of shaped the destiny of the country. But I guess our point, and I agree, we shouldn't be too negative or pessimistic. It's just that it's really important, I think, for each generation to be ambitious and not seeing Canada as a constellation of different interests and try to pull people together. Yes, it is difficult, but I think it's worth doing.
But let me read your words back to you, Robert, because I too don't want to be negative about this, but there's been a fundamental change in how we run it. You talk about the professionalization of partisan politics, meaning using increasingly sophisticated means by political parties and the backroom boys or the apparatchiks or whatever you want to call them, to gain and keep power. That they don't want to have a substantive debate or policy choices because that's too complicated. You just want to have the right image and the right code words and the right buttons to press at the right time, get power, then do what you want to do. It doesn't matter about having that debate.
Yeah, I think there's a fundamental conflict there. And I'll be very honest about it. Jacques Chrétien used to say that it's not worth being in politics if you don't win. And I don't disagree with it. So, without winning, you won't actually do anything in politics. But there's a fundamental difference between playing to win and then having actually a mandate to do substantive policy things for the country and accomplishing a vision. And this is what Sean and I keep referring to as competing visions for the future, as opposed to just winning election and then preparing for the next one, which is a dangerous cycle for the country and for modern politics. Because here's what happens is that the world is moving and that our competitors are taking decisions about their future. And that if we decide that the things that are difficult and complicated should be left on the sidelines, then Germany and the US and Singapore and Japan will take that space on the global supply chain. And at one point, we'll look at each other and we'll say, hey, our living standards are not what they used to be. So I think this is the difficulty of politics, is that it's not just about saying we'll throw more money at problems. It's more complicated than that. And I'm worried that politicians sometimes take the easy route. And it speaks to the desire of the electorate to sometimes be told, you know what, this is not possible, or this is not affordable right now. And we're going to need to do more homework to come to the right solution, you know?
And Senator Wallin,
politicians get punished for that. Go ahead, Sean.
I was just going to say, and this is why I'm so proud of the work that Robert and I have done together, because some of those big structural changes that we're going to have to make in order to compete in this kind of increasingly competitive global marketplace, against headwinds of aging demographics, the end of unipolarity, all of these, we're just living at a kind of an extraordinary time with so many big challenges facing our society that you can't solve for all of them on party line or in a single term. It's going to take a kind of political consensus that's going to require reform over a sustained period of time. We used to have a consensus around fiscal policy, for instance. That's eroded. But I think what we're trying to say is, yes, there's a lot to debate. Robert and I don't agree on every issue by any means. But on some of these big kind of structural challenges facing the society, let's debate it. And then let's get to the work of positioning Canada to succeed in the future. That's I think crucially important, and why I'm so proud to do the work that we've been doing over the past several years to try to catalyze a consensus for an economic strategy in light of all of these big developments that are occurring around us.
Let me ask you both just a couple of quick comments on what we saw unfold in this election. Did COVID-19 bring back big government forever, regardless of how incoherent the policy might be? Or is that kind of a one-off? What do we make of the NDP firmly holding that policy of go for the bronze, never go for the gold? Like, we want to be the conscience of the party. Are the Greens dead and gone, or is that a short-term political thing? So just grab a couple of those things and give me your thoughts. Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, on COVID, I don't think so. I think in a short, medium term, sure, I'll be an expansion of government's role because society needs it. But I think these things work in a certain pendulum, in that economies that have worked well, history shows that there's an important balance to be struck between public and private interventions. That too much state intervention could be very damaging to the economy, or too much spending over the long term. So I think economics, as the answer on a lot of this. I'll let Sean maybe speak more to the politics of the NDP and the Greens, but I would just warn people that those who argue, and I know I'm going to open a huge can of worms here, but when they talk about proportional representation,
yeah, I was coming to that, so jump in.
this is my worry, is that it would give these I don't want to use pejorative words, but less important parties a lot of leverage, a lot of importance, and they would actually imagine yesterday the results that we had. You would basically give them almost all the power to make government works. So I would have serious concerns around giving these parties a lot of power in the current situation.
Over to you, Sean.
See, I told you, Senator Wallin, we disagree on some issues. I've actually come around to proportional representation. We talked earlier about the kind of fractiousness of the Conservative coalition and the challenge between being responsive to core Conservative voters on one hand and growing the party's base on the other hand. One wonders if the solution isn't a proportional representation system in which the party devolves into a number of different parties that may be ideologically oriented or maybe regionally oriented that work together in the form of a coalition government, but don't necessarily need to kind of solve all of their differences within a big tent brokerage party. So I think in some ways, I've I've come around in recent years. Just on the question you started with, Senator Wallin, about has the pandemic led to resurgence of big government?
Yeah.
I broadly agree with what Robert has said, that there no doubt will be limits and a kind of ratchet back against some of the most significant excesses. But I do think that it's going to lead to changes in how we think about global supply chains. I think it's going to change the way we think about globalization to an extent. We're seeing this in a number of countries trying to reshore domestic capacities out of China, for instance.
Yep.
So I do think we're not going to simply return to the way we thought about economics and fiscal policy before the pandemic. I do think there probably will be a kind of return of political economy, thinking about the kind of role of public policy in shaping markets as opposed to merely responding to what markets produce on their own.
May I just add something on that, if I may?
Yeah.
And here's the difficult part, I think, in a crisis, an economic crisis like the one we just lived. I'm not saying it was easy for government, but it was essentially a role of transfers. Giving the income support to folks and businesses. In the world that Sean describes, the role of government becomes much more difficult to actually implement and come up with the right policies. In other words, it would be easy on the industrial policy, for example. Sean and I have discussed this many times, to do bad implementation, overreach, stuff that would actually be unhelpful to businesses or sectors if not done the proper way. So I just think it will need, if this is true, that governments, and I believe in it, in the medium short term will be more important in people's lives, we'll need to raise our game and be much better at what we do in terms of policy making, because transferring money is one thing, but actually coming up with the right solutions is more difficult.
Well, yeah, I mean, the reshoring, I mean, we couldn't provide masks. We didn't have, vaccine. We had no capacity to even deal in the early stages. Well, Sean, if you're being so generous about proportional representation, what about universal basic income? I mean, we've proved it can work with the CERB. Is that the next step?
Well, so this is where my instincts are pretty reliably conservative. I think one of the things we've seen through this experience is that we can solve for people's material needs, cut them a check, but work is so much more than that, isn't it? It brings a kind of series of non-material needs. So I'm opposed to a basic income, Senator Wallin, and so much so, in fact, that I would actually support wage subsidies to try to connect people who've been unemployed for a long period of time back to work, because I believe so deeply in the kind of important role that work and being productive has on people, not just for their paychecks, but for their sense of purpose and dignity and so on. So you can chalk me up as a hard no.
But as our friend Hugh Siegel says, it doesn't have to be a disincentive to work. I mean, the problem with the system we've got now is if people are on various welfare schemes, they get punished if they go to work. Guaranteed annual income would change that psychology so people could work. Anyway, Robert.
I would argue, actually, and I have so much respect for Senator Siegel, but I would argue that Canada does redistribution pretty well. And when you look at the Canada Child Benefit, if you look at GIS, OAS, you look at our system of student support at the post-secondary level, people who need help pretty much have basic income. So I would argue, in a way, we have a basic income system in Canada that is pretty, not universal, but pretty broad and pretty generous.
I am so glad that you two are joining forces and trying to work on some of these issues, because we really need to rethink the whole process here. And I think this election has really put that into pretty sharp relief. So lots of meat in that particular discussion. Sean Speer, the former senior economic advisor to Prime Minister Harper, now with the Monk School, and he's with the Public Policy Forum. He's the Fellow for Strategic Competitiveness. Robert Asselin, former budget and policy advisors to Prime Minister Martin and Trudeau, and now the Vice President of Policy at the Business Council. of Canada. We will be back to you in about 6 months, maybe a little sooner, to see if anyone's listening to you, because they should be. Thank you both
Thank
very
you.
much.
It was a
Thanks,
lot of
Senator
fun.
Wallin.
Thank you.
Bye. See
Bye-bye.
you. Thanks for joining us, everybody, for this edition of No Nonsense in the wake of the 2021 election. Talk to you soon.